Welcome to Revival Radio TV. Thanks for joining me today. I have a question. Is America founded on ideas from the Bible? Or how about this? Does revival spark change in government and society? The answer, obviously, to both questions is yes. Revival always brings change in the society and the government. Good people will create a good government. It's a bottom-up approach. And this highlights the big difference from a humanistic approach, which tries to force a good government from the top down. The truth is, you can't legislate morality, but you can change people's hearts and take moral stands for what is right. This is what Jesus was talking about when he said, "We are the salt of the earth, but if that salt loses its flavor, what good is it?" Well, today I want to explore how revival affected the roots of America. We hear a lot about how America is bad and founded on bad ideas and oppression. But it's an easy question to answer. The founders were prolific writers, and they left us their thoughts on what they believed and why. First, let's remember this. There was a huge revival going on in England. People were getting saved by the thousands. It was a unique era in all of history. In fact, it was called the First Great Awakening. I have here an original 1805 copy of the memoirs of George Whitefield. In the late 18th century, before the American Revolution, English preacher George Whitefield was spreading the fires of revival. In England, people were getting saved, and this upset the state-established Anglican Church. George Whitefield brought the First Great Awakening from England to the American colonies, holding open-air meetings and in churches. He was a great orator that God used to light the flames of revival. And it was in this revival fire we see God and government overlapping and fanning the flames of liberty.
George Whitefield is called the father of the first American Great Awakening, preaching 18,000 sermons to 10 million people. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean 13 times. In those days, it was 2 to 4 months per crossing. He spent nearly 3 years on ships alone. Now, George Whitefield was an Englishman, as myself, who loved and felt prophetically called to America. He had a rock star, a celebrity status, being America's most popular 18th century preacher. He was known by 80% of the colonists. Some estimates are that he spoke about 1,000 times a year. Amazing. In addition to his sermons, he shared 12,000 talks in small groups.
Now, this was before the American Revolution, and you have this English preacher, George Whitefield, spreading the fires of revival in America. God had specifically called him to prepare the ground for what God was about to do.
Sensing a divine call to America, he departed England in August of 1739, but with a burden for the colonists and a prayer that they would live as 13 unified colonies, almost as one nation under God.
Now, revival spread like wildfire, more than it did in England. Remember, we didn't have the state church trying to suppress the move of God. So the people in America, they were more independently minded. But what we did have was a generation that had grown lukewarm and forgotten the fervor of their forefathers. Well, that is until revival broke out, and it burned like fire through dry kindling, and it swept all 13 colonies from top to bottom. Listen to this. In 1739, Benjamin Franklin said, "It seemed as if the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street." Now, in this revival, American colonists seemed to find their feet that grew out of their return to faith, a growing sense of independence that turned into revolutionary fervor that was even being preached from the pulpits. The preachers were explaining the overlap of God and government. We've talked about the Black Robe Regiment before. Remember, it was these godly ideas like the God-given rights of man and limits of government that was driving this sense of a growing restlessness that led to an inevitable clash that began in Boston. And that sparked an American Revolution, and George Whitefield was there in the midst of it.
And when the Boston Massacre happened, George Whitefield rode the breadth of the colonies. There was no trains then, so he could minister to and comfort the families. Now, he would only live another 6 months more, but he still set a brutal and relentless pace.
On his final day of life, after his usual day of preaching many times, he had retired to sleep. Hearing people calling his name, he went to the window. Whitefield picked up a candle and with his Bible in the other hand said, "I will preach until the lights are out." And he did. The next morning they knocked on his door, but no answer. They knocked several times, then broke in. They found Mr. Whitefield on his knees beside the bed with his Bible. All that was left of the candle was melted wax. They saw his body there, but he was home with Jesus. The lights were out, and he was done preaching.
In 1775, when the American colonists in Boston were preparing to battle the British at Bunker Hill, the colonists would stop at the tomb of the famous evangelist George Whitefield. They opened up his grave. They took pieces of his clothing, even his hair, and they carried them almost like divine favor in this war that had seemed so impossible for them to win.
Whitefield's message, both personally and politically, became synonymous with the struggle for liberty. While there are more than a dozen noteworthy, brave Black Robe Regiment pastors, it was Whitefield that gave voice to God and government and embodied the spiritual foundations of the idea of a free America, the city on a hill whose light will not be extinguished. John Witherspoon is a preacher you don't often hear much about, but he's regarded as the man who taught our founders. And it was his work and convictions that instilled these ideas that go all the way back to John Knox.
The Reverend John Witherspoon was born in Scotland in 1722. Now, he descended from the great reformer, that Holy Spirit firebrand, John Knox himself. But by the age of 20, he'd already earned his doctorate in theological studies. He was brilliant. Now, as a young clergyman, he'd even earned the recognition of well-regarded people of the time. In fact, it prompted both Benjamin Rush and Richard Stockton, now both future signers of the Declaration of Independence, along with George Whitefield himself, to recruit him to be the president of the College of New Jersey. It was later known as, Princeton. Now, when the founders of Princeton began, it was their hope to find men who would want to educate the students in a way that they would leave the college as well-versed but well-respected men who could choose to work in either the state or the church. It was even a time when there was a discussion among the founders of making Hebrew the official language of America. As the college's president, Witherspoon, he made sure that Hebrew was taught and mandated, but also all the graduates had to attend his class on morals, where he used Adam Smith's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. This was the man who built a biblical foundation in our founding fathers.
By 1770, Witherspoon was advocating resistance to the crown. John Adams is quoted as saying that Reverend Witherspoon was a clear, sensible minister and as high a son of liberty as any man in America. Clearly, his Scottish roots resonated with the climate in America. Witherspoon was vocal in not only his spiritual beliefs, but also in the individual rights of man. He used his position to advocate rebellion against the tyranny of the English crown. He received an appointment to the Continental Congress for his efforts. Witherspoon stated, "I willingly embrace the opportunity of declaring my opinion without any hesitation that the cause in which America is now in arms is the cause of justice, of liberty, and of human nature." He was certainly vocal in the Continental Congress. When the delegates met to vote for ratification of the Declaration of Independence, one delegate who opposed the ratification stated, "We're not ripe for revolution." Witherspoon declared, "Not ripe, sir. We are not only ripe for the measure, but in danger of rotting for the want of it. During a congressional day of fasting and prayer in 1776, Witherspoon preached a sermon to Congress. Listen to this. It spoke of the importance of the covenant between the American colonists and God. They understood the covenant their forefathers made with God. In fact, it was common for them to compare themselves to the relationship between Israel and God. The colonists had a strong civic belief in God and country. Witherspoon said they must renounce sin and corruption and act with justice, selflessness, and patience. Governing themselves and their passions would make you truly independent in yourselves. His claim was God would bless the American cause of liberty if they followed their part of the covenant. Reverend Witherspoon was the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. Witherspoon advocated for a government founded on biblical principles designed to protect the freedom of a people of moral character. A bottom-up versus a top-down approach. If you want good government, make good people. This is why revival is crucial for America. So we've talked about the biblical foundations of America and ministers that brought revival and laid these foundations. But there were Christian philosophers as well, who the founders were reading that helped give voice to their ideas. The ideas of these philosophers are just as relevant today as they were in their day. Many of the problems we are facing are because we've forgotten these ideas and how individuals react if left alone, or what happens if these rights are violated. Because no one seems to teach history anymore, the leftists are trying to take us down these same bad roads again. It's not forgetting history, it's history they never learned. They're ignorant because of their pop culture and the failure of the church to occupy and do its job. The difference between biblical-based philosophers and humanist philosophers is that the biblically enlightened ones recognize the fallen state of human nature and explore how to make good government over bad people. The church is called to occupy. And until Jesus returns, we must do our jobs and occupy every part of society, education, business, and government to make a difference. Charles Finney blamed the church if the schools or the government wasn't working. This is why secular America doesn't work top down with unrenewed citizens. America is designed to work bottom up with renewed citizens, or at least citizens with a basic common civic virtue. Because we're free and we cherish liberty, but we have laws and we have justice. Now let's talk about how the humanist Enlightenment's ideas are completely opposite those of the Bible. Humanist philosophers feel mankind is neither good or bad, but a product of his environment. So this idea gives rise to utopian theories like socialism and communism, that if we can just make things equal, then people will be good. This ignores the empirical evidence of history, which is full of humans being horrible to each other. Mankind is in a fallen state, and evil exists and must be governed, especially if he is unrenewed, but not governed where the government trespasses on God-given rights and liberty without justice. So let's recap. The First Great Awakening brought revival to America, and as the American church grew, it sought to establish a government based on biblical ideas. And where did they get these biblical ideas? From the Christian Enlightenment that resulted from the Reformation that returned the Bible to the church. Now let's look at the four men the founders quoted the most in the founding documents of America. And let me show you how they were biblically inspired. In the opening days of the American Revolution, the Patriots carried this flag, an appeal to heaven. And it's a direct quote from John Locke's book, The Two Treatises of Government. The phrase is an expression of the right of revolution used by British philosopher John Locke in chapter 14. In it, Locke quotes 2 Corinthians 8:21, "For we aim at what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man." Washington flew the appeal flag when all other alternatives of seeking justice had been exhausted, as only an appeal to heaven remained.
John Locke is widely regarded as one of the most influential thinkers of the Enlightenment. Now, he was a product of his age. He was both a writer, a theologian, a philosopher, and a medical doctor. Now, both his parents were Puritans, and as such, Locke was raised that way. He was a passionate Christian. He even wrote a verse-by-verse commentary on Paul's epistles. He wrote a topical Bible that was called the Commonplace Book of the Holy Bible. It listed verses by subject. He wrote of the reasonableness of Christianity as stated in the scriptures. But his book on 2 treatises of government is the one that changed England and America. In this book, he quoted the Bible 1,500 times. It's the primary work influencing the American Declaration of Independence. Many phrases in the Declaration are almost word-by-word quotes, like life, liberty, and property. Well, that phrase, Jefferson, he changed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Locke's landmark book, he put forth both the revolutionary ideas concerning the natural rights of man and the social contract. It was the kernel to the American Bill of Rights, the idea of separation of church and state to protect the freedom of worship.
John Locke's ideas were a big influence on the run-up to the Revolution, including the idea that if the government is not preserving these unalienable rights, the people have not just the right, but a responsibility to revolt and install a limited government. Adam Smith said, "Liberate his gift and his nation becomes strong." He was a Scottish Presbyterian and is best known for this book, The Wealth of Nations. It is this book that laid the foundation for free market capitalism. Listen to this quote. "Little else is required to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence, but peace, easy taxes, a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things." I really like this guy. He was against paternalism, or we would say a nanny state. A nanny state thinks they know what you need better than you do. He believed every man knew what was best for himself and should be allowed to choose and not be mandated or told what was best for him. He opposed what he called the visible hand of government. It usually does worse than individuals do when allowed to choose for themselves. But he's best known for his revolutionary economic idea, the invisible hand.
Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, it was in this book he presented his most influential idea, the invisible hand. It was radical, a new idea, but it had biblical roots like sowing and reaping, the personal liberty to profit and to accumulate personal property. This benefits everyone. He called this invisible hand that drives the free markets from the bottom up, not from the top down.
These ideas, including the division of labor, helped birth the Industrial Revolution, and they were read by the founders who incorporated them into the foundations of America. Now, this book came out in 1776, so it was influential in the organizing of policy and the writing of the Constitution. But it was this book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that influenced the founders themselves. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, and this book takes Bible-based morality and applies it as good ideas of right and wrong. Many of the founders were educated by the Reverend John Witherspoon, who, as the head of Princeton, required his students to read this book. He taught a moral philosophy class using this book, and he instilled in these men a Bible-based morality that helped organize a moral code of citizenship from the bottom up versus the top down. I have in my hand an 1800s copy of Blackstone's Common Law, and it was this set of 4 books that Blackstone wrote that changed both England and America all the way into the 20th century.
William Blackstone's Common Law Now, this both changed England and America. It was the law of the land for England and of America for 200 years. Now, when Blackstone, he started to write the commentaries on the laws of England, it was during a time when the law was determined by the king or the lord of the land. There was no unified law across the land to access, no established precedent to go by. The king and the nobility were in charge of what happened. Thus, the law would differ by county, and more often than not, the poor suffered. Now, as a Christian, however, Blackstone, he based his code of law on the scripture. He was wanting it to be fair and equitable. Now, what he wrote, it became the foundation for law, not only in England, but then later on in the American colonies. His commentaries, it became the primary source of information on English common law in America. They were so well received in the colonies that it was stated that before Parliament now in 1775, that they have sold nearly as many Blackstone commentaries in America as in England. So Blackstone's popularity in America, it continued long after the Revolution. James Madison, he said this, "I very cheerfully express my approval of Blackstone's commentaries." Now, Blackstone was cited by both the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist in the struggle for the ratification of the Constitution. But Blackstone's greatest contribution was to make English, its common laws, the same in every way that could be understood by all. After all, he was not only a theologian, but he was also a judge.
Blackstone argued that judges are not to make law. They are to determine what the law is and then apply it. Blackstone emphasized in his writings that all law was founded on God, both the law of nature and revealed law. Revealed law was God's law that's revealed in the Bible. Men's instincts and nature, he called the laws of nature. He wrote that God laid down certain immutable laws of human nature that includes a man's free will. And because of this free will, men need to be regulated and restrained by law and government. I love this part of the story. Listen to this. William Blackstone was an Oxford theologian, and he based his law on the Bible. In fact, there are so many Bible references that a young lawyer named Charles Finney kept running into these Bible references. So to understand the law, Finney had to go out and buy a Bible. Well, reading his Bible led to his getting saved, and the rest, they say, is history. Charles Finney is one of America's greatest voices on revival and was the driving minister of the Second Great Awakening. Just as John Locke was the primary philosopher whose writings influenced the Declaration of Independence, this book, The Spirit of Laws, was one of the primary influences on the writing of the Constitution. Let me read this. Montesquieu said, "A constitution is needed to sustain liberty, but you need a certain civic virtue to maintain it. And if you have a constitution, you should cherish it because it's a monumental thing."
Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu. That's a mouthful, but in America, we just call him very simply Montesquieu. He was a French judge, but he was a man of letters. He was a historian. The American founders quoted Montesquieu. They quoted him second only to John Locke. What you need to understand, that even though Montesquieu was a French philosopher, his ideas were not from the French Enlightenment. Rather, his big idea of the separation of powers, it came from his study of Rome and England. It was while he was studying in England, we see the separation of powers here today, as the executive, which we call the president, but the legislative, which we see as just making the American laws today, and then the judicial, which is the judges of the country. So we have three branches of government that were picked up by James Madison and the other writers of the United States Constitution.
Locke promoted liberty. Montesquieu promoted moderation. Montesquieu didn't trust politicians, He believed power corrupted even good politicians. So he proposed checks and balances so that each branch was accountable to the other. Montesquieu said, a constitution is needed to sustain liberty, but you need a certain civic virtue to maintain it. And the founders understood you needed citizens with a basic decency or good civic virtue to maintain good government. And since the driving motive for the American Revolution was liberty and the freedom of the church, the idea of a good people was to support a bottom-up government of good people versus a top-down forced morality. This is why revival in every generation and the church being salt and light is so critical. Let me just make this one side point here. America, in its founding documents, was designed for maximum liberty over good people with good civic virtue. We're a nation that depends on basic Judeo-Christian values to operate in that liberty. This is why America doesn't work with a godless population. If we want to fix America, then it's up to the church to bring revival to the streets. Does revival spark change government and society? Or does a free environment help spark revival? Obviously, the answer is yes. It's harder to have revival with government oppression, but it is possible. But revival always brings change in the society and the government. Good people will create good government. It's a bottom-up approach. You can't legislate morality, but you can change people's hearts and take moral stands for what's right. And I'll close with this thought. The philosophers' ideas based on biblical principles were enshrined by the founders in the virtual DNA of America. This is the godly heritage established for the freedom of the church and the base for the gospel, for the country that, as John Winthrop declared Jesus' words over, that we will be a city shining on a hill. Thanks for joining me here on Revival Radio TV. As always, go to the website, check us out, revivalradiotv.com, the interactive timeline. Follow us, Facebook and Rumble, YouTube, all of the places that you find Revival Radio. Stay in touch with us as we continue to bring revival to America.